So, you were looking to sample 90s R&B, and you're probably wondering, is it really as easy as grabbing a sample, putting a beat under it, filtering it out, and calling it a day? Honestly, it might be. Sometimes a sample just speaks for itself and you don't need to add anything. But there's a lot of sauce that you're not adding to your beat, which may or may not be your intention if you just decide to play the sample, loop it, and call it a day. And I'm not knocking everybody that's saying you should do this, and I'm not knocking the people that teach it to y'all like that, but trust me, there's a lot that you're not doing or a lot that you're just glossing over by saying you should flip a sample or call it a day. So I'm here to give you more insight in my process of flipping a 90s R&B sample. Let's go and get it moving. Now, in terms of what I like to sample, I usually go for the more low-key songs, the down-tempo songs, or the ballads, because I think they're very gentle, and I think that the samples that come out of there are very easy to sit down in your mix. You really got to, the sample that you work with determines your workflow. If you have a sample that's hard to sit down in your mix, you're just making it difficult for yourself, needlessly. Stylistically, I like the sample songs that came out between 1996 and 2005. I really love how R&B onwards from 1996 started to evolve. I'm a big fan of early 2000s R&B. I think that's the time period that I remember the most fond. And stylistically, I don't really like what happened between 2005 and 2012 in terms of R&B music. I mean, I do love a lot of stuff that came out there, but in generally, stylistically, I didn't enjoy it as much. But that's my takeaway. You go and find what works for you. Okay, so I got my mixer track pulled up here, and I want to talk to you about some very essential processing. And that's essentially your compressor and your EQ. Now look at this. Essentially, we're working with an extensively mastered record. So there's a lot of processing on that record, and that's what causes it to peak so much. That also means that it's probably going to interfere with the vocals you're trying to get on the beat or the other elements you're trying to add to your beat. So my decision is to take out a multi-band compressor, set the ratio rather high, actually low attack, low release, actually very low threshold, and just let it squish that mid frequency for me so that I've got some space and some breathing room. I'm gonna play it without compression and with compression. With compression, the sample is much more tucked in, it's much more gentle, it's not dominating, and the vocalists will have plenty of space to do their thing once they hop on the record. Another essential piece of processing is your EQ, because sampling R&B is an aesthetic, and with that aesthetic comes that heavily filtered R&B sample. Chixtape, LMA, Jacquees, every artist that you've heard on a 90s R&B record, well, except for Drake, I guess, usually their producers have the sample filtered out. And that is because that sample is actually more of an ambience than an actual instrument. It's more of the canvas, and the rest gets added to it. And you want your canvas to be ready, of course, for when you start painting on it. So that's how I approach my 90s R&B samples. They're not the instrument per se, they're just there for ambience. And that allows the vocalist to stand out a lot. So then I spiced it up with phases, of course, and flare. I added another EQ just to make another big cut. Reverb and delay are very essential for that wetness because you don't want a dry ass sample. I see a lot of y'all sampling R&B. Y'all got your sample sitting in the mix mad dry. Please don't do that. You are missing out on essential sauce, and you are making the sample very tired to listen to, especially since you got only most of the times people only have one part that they're looping for the entire song. That's tiring as shit. Now, another technique that you may want to use when you're sampling R&B, and this is all, of course, assuming that you're not going to be adding a pad, that is doubling the sample and using a low pass filter to make it more thick in the low end. So basically the two samples are complementing each other. You see here I got two tracks, sample 1, sample 2. One is more brighter and one is far more filtered out and only has a low end. I turned down the volume And I let them mesh together with some compression, and that gives you a real rich sample, because you don't want your sample to be sounding too thin, because especially since you're filtering out a lot of the frequencies on the first sample, you do want to add some thickness. So just gently fading the second sample in, it really works wonders, and I recommend you start doing that. When it comes to sampling R&B, I feel getting the sample right, as in getting the proper chops, arranging it properly, getting a mood, getting the drums under it, and getting it to sit in the mix. You know, I feel that's 80% of your beat. The other 20% is just experimenting, fucking around, and adding elements you like, such as this piano. So see, here's where that brightness and contrast comes into play again. I got a heavily filtered out set of samples, and that piano is easily distinguishable when you listen to the beat. I like that contrast, that bright piano and that heavily filtered sample. But what I also like about that piano is that it's a little piece of me that is injected in the beat. Because sampling is amazing when you turn a record into something dope, but when you add something of yourself to it, other than drums of course, it's, you know, it makes the process a lot more fun. A lot of people probably won't opt to add their own melodies, you know, except for bass, of course, because it requires a lot of playing by ear, and I think that a lot of people know how to do that, but I think that people simply don't have the patience to do that. Like I said at the beginning, you could just flip the sample, put drums on it, call it a day, but you're missing out on a lot of sauce if you are just calling it a day at that. Because now you have a beat. Now you have a real composition that speaks. Now the cool thing, the good thing is now you have your sample in the back, and I'm assuming that at this point you've got some instruments, but that allows you to put your drums up front a lot, and that is definitely what you're going to be hearing. And that may not even be necessarily because the drums are being put up front. That's because they simply stand out because the rest is so dark and filtered. So I definitely recommend you get some really hard hitting drums actually, if that fits your beat, because what I've got here, I even have all of my drums set to a drum bus with some compression on it to make it more tighter and to make it more upfront. I recommend you do that if you can. In terms of which drum sounds to use, I feel that rim shots are amazing for beats like these. I feel that claps are a little bit too bright, snares are a little bit too harsh and too thick, and a rim shot is just that ideal balance. I happen to have made this beat because I was very inspired by Bryson Tiller's Only You freestyle, so I really wanted to make my own, and I did. I think I did an amazing job. But that also explains my desire for rim shots. One other thing, I definitely recommend you add tidbits like a percussion loop and a hi-hat loop. I got this hi-hat loop from a Nick Mira kit. I think it's doing amazing just by filling up that background a little bit and getting you a real complete composition. So in a nutshell, sweat the details. Honestly, don't cheap out on the details. I mean, it's cool if you can puff your chest and say, cool, I made this beat in 10 minutes. But what if you spent an additional 10 minutes with the time you have just experimenting and adding layers, subtracting layers, and getting the perfect composition? I would like to encourage y'all to use as much of the track as you can. You have an entire song before you that's being structured and you're chopping it up. But, you know, just looping an 8-bar loop over and over, it might get tiring to your listener, no matter how good you're processing it. So what I did in this beat, I actually have numerous separate chops. You can hear that my hook is different from my verse. So variation is key as always. So explore your track, use different chops, and I guarantee you're going to have a far more interesting beat. Let me just show you what I did. See, different samples, great transition, interesting for your listener. Do that.